Yes. So hey everyone, I'll give a brief talk about cross-chain liquidity and the challenges that different teams are facing when they try to get their stablecoins or other assets into a variety of other chains. So brief intro on Dialectic. We are major on-chain liquidity providers. We provide liquidity to stablecoins, ETH, and Bitcoin. And it's all on-chain, LPing into DEXs, lending markets, bridges, or anything else that's on-chain and needs liquidity. And the way that we allocate the liquidity that we have and the way that we generate yield for our investors is that we follow a risk-adjusted portfolio construction approach. So the first thing for us to look at is always what's the risk exposure that we have, what are the underlying risk exposures that we have, and from there we can understand whether or not an opportunity is appealing. And it all starts with due diligence. Like the first thing that we need to do when there's a new opportunity is that we need to do due diligence on the opportunity to understand all of the risk exposures. So the way that we look at risk is that we have a graph-based view of DeFi. So like what we can do is that for any opportunity in DeFi, we can do a segregation of all the underlying dependencies of the opportunity. So as you can see here, this is a aerodrome position on base, and the assets in the pool is USDC and USD by reserve. And as you can see, if you do the full breakdown of all of the dependencies of this position, it becomes quite complex. There's a lot of underlying exposures to different smart contracts. There's an exposure to an oracle. There's exposure to like upgradable proxies and all these things. So this is for us like the first thing. That is the input, and this is what we need to understand. The main categories of risk that we look at is the risk inherent in the chain that the position is on, the risk that comes from the bridge, if we need to bridge the liquidity to another chain, and we look at the smart contracts, we look at the oracles that are involved, also the economic mechanism of the protocols. In case of lending markets, there is risk on the collateral and bad debt and all of these things. And more specifically, an example of this is like if we have two opportunities that we are looking at, both opportunities require liquidity, and we do the due diligence and the risk assessment. What we basically need to do is to do a multidimensional optimization. So we need to understand what are all of the risk exposures, how much is the APR, and then we need to compare all positions on a relative basis to understand which position is more efficient to deploy in. So in the case of this example, the positions are very similar. The one that's marked as opportunity 1 has a bit lower APR, but it doesn't have any chain risk and any bridge risk. So this would be an opportunity on mainnet, whereas the opportunity 2 is an example opportunity that's deployed on another chain, and so it also has bridge exposure. And so what we basically need to do is understand how much is the risk premium for the extra exposure that we would take on by bridging the liquidity to the other chain, and by taking on the exposure to the bridge. And when it comes to like the bridge exposure, there's some drawbacks that I think are important to mention. If you're a stablecoin or if you're another protocol and you're looking to bootstrap your liquidity on other chains, from a liquidity provider perspective, there's a few inefficiencies that we need to take into consideration and that we need to price into the APR that we expect for that position. So for example, if we do deploy liquidity on an L2, we take the exposure of the L2, the infrastructure, the sequencer, everything that's running. We also have exposure to the bridging infrastructure. So in case it's like Stargate, or if it's Wormhole, or if it's Chainlink, like all of these bridges have their own mechanisms, and they all have some risk vectors that we need to consider and price into the expected APR. There's also additional inefficiencies, like if it's a native bridge, then there's an opportunity cost on bridging back. There may be lower liquidity on the other chain. So the point being here is that if you want liquidity on other chains that are not mainnet, there needs to be an understanding that the extra risks and the extra complexities that the liquidity provider has by deploying those positions comes with an additional cost. Because we could just deploy a position on mainnet, not have to deal with all of this, and if we get the same or a very similar yield, then it doesn't really make sense for us to deploy the positions on other chains. So as a project, what you can consider, or like what things to like think about if you're thinking to bridge your assets to another chain and bootstrap liquidity there. It's on the one side just like the infrastructure that you're deploying on. If it's like a super chain, if it's like OP stack, or it's some like Arbitrum Orbit chain, those are all things that are battle tested. Those are all like technologies that have been out for a while. So that's like lower risk than if it's some new EVM, if it's some new like mechanism that hasn't been battle tested. So that's one consideration. The other consideration is around the security and the settlement guarantees. So for example, on like a lot of the optimistic rollups, there's a 7-day withdraw queue. So that also adds some complexity because the liquidity providers are not getting any yield while they're bridging back, whereas something like a ZK rollup has much faster time to bridge back. So that's a benefit. And then also on like the compatibility, like some of the ZK chains have like some different opcodes, and that changes the behavior of smart contracts. So that's also things to consider when like choosing these infrastructures. And the same thing on the bridges. There's like a lot of different ways in which you can bridge your assets. There are some chains that have, there's some bridges that have their own security models. Other bridges, you have to run your own validator, and all of those are also compromises that kind of affect how the risk is perceived of the opportunity. And then if the risk is perceived to be higher, then the liquidity providers expect higher APR, which makes the position more costly for the protocol who's deploying that. Yes, that was most of it. If you want to ask some questions around like how we think about deploying liquidity on other chains, feel free to speak to me or to some of the people on my team. Yep, thanks so much.